very orchestrated world. All right, last week we went over
the days.
basically the calendar, the days, and things of that nature. Gave a nice prelude up to this point. We covered the yearly Sabbaths and how they differentiated from the feasts, and they had the weekly Sabbaths.
It's going to be recorded, is it?
Yes.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm doing this on a second back half.
No, that's fine. I was just making sure for Brother Nigel, that's all.
Oh yeah. So this week, having set the base structure and everything, now we're going to get into the actual days and the events and what Jesus was really going through as he was being tried, tortured, and murdered, basically. Might as well call it what it is.
Yeah.
Sacrifice, but they murdered him. All right, so the key to understanding the chronology of the events leading up to, including Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection, was that there were actually 2 Sabbaths in that week. All right, with 1 day of preparation between them, because that's what split the 2. So they weren't a continuous long period. It makes all the Gospels fall into place, and the fulfillment of Christ's words actually become even clearer. So correct harmonization of all the facts will bear this actually out. So when we get into the month of Nisan, funny as it sounds, the month of Nisan, we see on Tuesday the 13th, okay? This is when Jesus and the 12 disciples came into Jerusalem from Bethany to partake of the Passover meal on this day. All right. Now, Jesus ate an early Passover meal with his disciples. After the meal, the walks with his disciples towards the Mount of Olives. Okay. This is also when they're headed to Gethsemane, basically, Mount of Olives. Jesus was betrayed by Judas at the Olive Grove in Gethsemane, arrested and brought before the high priest Caiaphas. Okay. This is all on that day. Now, trial ended for that one at daybreak. Okay. Now, Wednesday, the 14th, because now you're getting into daybreak, which is 6 a.m., so it's another day. Okay, 'cause you have to remember, the Jews counted the days from 6 a.m. all the way to 6 p.m., like a 12-hour day, basically. That's how they were doing their calculations. Wednesday, the 14th, was the preparation for the preparation day for the annual, not the weekly Sabbath. This was the high Sabbath, the annual Sabbath, okay? Only one of these in a year, thus giving the term annual, okay? In the morning, Jesus was brought before Pilate the governor. This is on that same day.
On Wednesday, okay.
Yep, on Wednesday. Okay. Daybreak, so you had all that night. That night of Tuesday was when Peter had denied the Lord. You had the trial at Caiaphas. Okay. You had the crowing of the rooster, the 3rd.
Right.
Daybreak. Okay, so that's when that all happens. Now, in the morning of the 14th, Jesus is brought before Pilate. Now, later that day, same day, 14th, Jesus was crucified and died around 3 p.m. Okay, so 3 hours short of the full day.
You said around 3?
Mm-hmm. Around 3. Now, between 4 and 6, this was very rushed when you think about it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You have Nicodemus and Joseph going to Pilate saying, release his body to us. Pilate amazed that he died that fast. Okay. The centurion verifying, yes, he is dead. Pilate saying, yes, okay, may have the body. Within 2 hours, between 4 and 6, you have Joseph and Nicodemus preparing the body with both Marys, placing it in the tomb, Joseph's tomb, and closing the tomb. So it's a very rushed burial. Okay. Which later explains also why they returned later after the Sabbath and stuff,
Right.
to come and add more to the body.
Right.
To continue to take care of it, because it's a very rushed burial. So they come back later to check on the body and also continue the practice of anointing the body with additional fragrances and perfumes and stuff like that. Because you might ask, well, why did they come back and do that? Well, because it was a very rushed, burial in the tomb.
Yeah, I was thinking, oh,
Very
maybe it's
quick.
just a part of their process where they do it, which just seems
I mean,
strange.
they had to get him down, clean him, wrap him, and get him into the tomb and roll the tomb before the Sabbath began, because there was no work to be done.
Oh, right.
And all the bodies had to be taken care of before the Sabbath. They were
No.
not allowed to be
They return the same night?
That was all between 4 and 6,
Okay.
before actual nighttime fell.
No, they returned
Oh, they
later on
returned.
another day
They
Yes.
return another day, okay.
after the Sabbath.
I'll show you that. This is when, down here,
Okay.
Mary arrives. She went back to take care of what was
Right.
not taken care of.
Gotcha.
So
That
it's
makes
all going to
sense.
start to kind of pop here as you're saying, like, oh,
That makes
that's
sense.
why they did that. Right, okay, makes sense. All right, so we have the annual Sabbath beginning at sunset. Now, sunset this time of the year in Jerusalem is about 6:30 to 7 p.m. Okay, so now they're having to leave the tomb and get home quickly because they have to be indoors by sunset.
Right.
Okay, no work. That's your first night right there. Okay, this is where it all starts kind of making sense. Now, Thursday the 15th, this is your first day, at daybreak. You got your first day. It's also your second night. Okay? The Lord was very literal. Okay, we'll see where in Scripture, and I'll review this, where you can see Jews saying something transliteral, where they can say, refer to as like 3 days being 3 years, and things like that in Scripture. But when the Lord said that the Son of Man, we said 3 days and 3 nights,
Mm-hmm.
as was Jonah in the belly of the whale, he was being very literal.
Right.
That there will be 3 days and 3 nights. There's no misconception here as to this being any other time frame. He's very, very specific. So how it could be a day and a half or 2 days would not fit.
Right.
So on the Thursday, the 15th, okay, this was the first annual Sabbath or high day, the first day of unleavened bread. The only one that stayed at that tomb after Joseph, Nicodemus, and the two Marys left after preparing the body and rolling the stone was the Roman guard. He's the only one outside the tomb right now,
Right.
still. So the tomb is being guarded and secured by sealing it with a stone and a Roman guard. Day one, first day and second night. Okay, so the annual Sabbath now ends sunset on the 15th. Okay, so 6:30 to 7 p.m. on Thursday, Sabbath ended. Friday, the 16th, you have your second day, third night. This is where the weekly Sabbath now begins, at sunset Friday night. And no work is to be done as commanded in the fourth commandment.
Weekly, you said?
Yep.
At sunset.
At sunset. So you're going to see also in this time frame here, they have the annual Passover, okay? I'm sorry, the annual Sabbath, excuse me, for the unleavened bread, the annual high Sabbath, okay? there's no way a trial would have taken place in that time frame.
Right.
It was unlawful. Not that the trial was legal,
But the work to get there.
right, with all the people running around, transporting him all over, crucifying him as well, would not have happened,
Right.
okay? Would not have happened.
And they wouldn't have gone back on Friday to prepare because they had to prepare for the Sabbath.
Right, you wouldn't have caught all the Pharisees out there mocking him at the cross, none of that would have occurred. These guys, as ridiculous as they were, would still have held to a certain legal line. So, no, that's not going to happen. And they knew that, so they had to have it happen at a certain time.
Right.
They had to get it done. That's why they were under such pressure, because they knew. So we see on Friday, the second day, third night, okay? It's the annual Sabbath's now over. The weekly Sabbath begins at sunset Friday night. No work is to be done as commanded in the fourth commandment. Saturday, it's your third day. Okay. The weekly Sabbath, the women rested on the weekly Sabbath. Everybody's down for the whole day. Jesus rose around sunset.
That's another weekly Sabbath? Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yep, you got your
So he rose.
regular Sabbath now. Yeah.
So regular.
And that's, oh yeah,
Yeah.
because that's Saturday.
Right.
Then what was that second one then? That was also a weekly Sabbath also. Right?
No, Friday was the day they prepared for the Sabbath. Sabbath begins at sunset.
Weekly Sabbath.
Right.
Oh,
They had that
okay.
day of preparation prior to
Weekly
it.
Sabbath.
Right, and it begins on sunset. And when does it end? Sunset Saturday? Is that when the Sabbath ends?
Yep, getting there.
Okay.
Yep.
Preparation, okay.
Now the weekly Sabbath is on Saturday. Okay, because technically it starts Friday night.
So they're trying to get everything done for Saturday.
So you have it Friday night, 6:30, 7 p.m. starting, and goes till sunset Saturday. Okay, because it's a 24-hour period. Now, around sunset, exactly 3 days and 3 nights, because now you have all of your 3 days and all of your 3 nights, just like Jesus said there would be. Exactly. Okay? Right after the burial, Jesus rose around sunset. That would constitute your 72-hour period right there. And this would also fulfill the sign of Jonah and authenticate Jesus' messiahship right there. Because the weekly Sabbath ends at sunset Saturday night. That's when they're in the clear, they're okay. Sunday.
Jesus obeys the laws even while he's dead.
That's right.
Except for when.
Because until he rose, they were still under the old law.
Right.
Except when he chose to heal people by spitting, but that was to show that you don't put the law above mercy.
Now Sunday, you have the women brought the prepared spices early in the morning, okay, while it was still dark, just like it says in Scripture. When they arrived, they found that Jesus had already arisen. He was already gone. So Mary arrives, it's still dark, tomb empty. He's gone.
The guards are all fainted.
And she runs.
Peter.
Peter.
I wonder what Jesus was doing all that night, hanging out with the crickets. I do wonder.
And that's it right there. I mean, it's in a nutshell. So you see, it's very easy why he did not die on Good Friday. It's scripturally impossible, physically impossible. It would have gone directly against what God said. Would not have fulfilled the prophecy. I mean, there's so many reasons right there you blow it out of the water.
So each of the Jewish days was from 6 to 6. Is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah,
6
rough
to 6.
time frame.
Okay.
Because the way they did it was
Just want to make sure. I wrote
sun
that down right.
rise to sunset.
Right. Right.
But at that particular time of the year, they're looking at about 12 hours of,
Right.
12 to 13 hours of daylight, basically. Because as soon as that sun disappeared from the horizon, man, they better be wherever they're supposed to be, or otherwise, no good.
Right.
You're in big trouble. Yeah. Kind of the opposite of the vampire.
They were like, oh no, we gotta go get
Yeah.
Go take care of this
So,
whole animals, those
When you
chintzy
take
priests.
yourself out of the mindset that we're in,
Yeah.
you know, like, we register days and nights differently.
Yeah.
you
So
know.
technically, it wouldn't be March for them. It could be some other month.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
makes sense. Okay.
So,
It's weird.
now having put that out,
It's interesting.
yeah, it really makes people, really makes you think,
Yeah.
you know. All right, so getting a little into the Jewish trials. I'm trying to get more into the behind the scenes here. The Jewish trials. Now, shortly after daybreak, Jesus was tried before Caiaphas and the political Sanhedrin and found guilty of blasphemy. Okay. Significantly, we never read of two witnesses coming forward with collaborating stories that would permit the death sentence to be meted out to Christ. Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin were bound by Jewish law, which plainly stated, "At the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses shall he that is to die be put to death. At the mouth of one witness he shall not be put to death." Okay. The law went on to state, "One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin in any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three shall a matter be established." However, we are told that at the trial many bear false witness against him, and their witness agreed not together. So they're trying to get all these witnesses, you know, that they're trying to call out, and yet their stories can't. I mean, they're all standing there listening to each other, and they still can't get their story straight. And the only way you could really met out a death sentence or a judgment was to have at least two stories completely or meshed together like that and agree with each other. They couldn't even get that. So it's unbelievable. This was a total circus fiasco here. Now, a study of Jewish law actually reveals that a number of those laws were broken the night Jesus was arrested and convicted. I mean, they broke several of their own laws even. One, arrests could not be made at nighttime. You couldn't even arrest people at nighttime. And yet they did.
Oh wow.
Yeah, pretty fierce. They were not allowed by Jewish law to arrest somebody at nighttime. Okay. The time and date of the trial were illegal because it took place on the eve of the Sabbath, okay, the annual high Sabbath,
Right.
no less. And it was a time that precluded any opportunity for a required adjournment to the next day in the event of a conviction. This is where it gets interesting. When they pronounced a verdict, you had to wait a day to actually pronounce judgment.
Right.
They were trying to pronounce judgment right there.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
That's why.
Oh, this whole thing was orchestrated.
Yeah.
Exactly, down to the time frame.
Yeah.
What was frustrating them was they kept pushing and pushing, and they just couldn't quite make it go. So they kept ramming it through anyway. They're going to we're going to find somebody to take this on and just kill it. Get it done. Get it over with. So, yeah, all this was illegal. The Sanhedrin was without any authority to instigate charges. It was only supposed to investigate charges. They're only the investigative part. But in Jesus' trial, the court itself formulated the charges. They actually brought the charges forward, not investigated them. Totally different. The stringent requirement of two witnesses testifying in agreement to merit the death penalty had not been met. They couldn't even get two witnesses to agree with each other on the charges. The court did not even meet in the regular meeting place of the Sanhedrin, as was required by Jewish law. They were supposed to meet by law in the Sanhedrin in the daytime.
Right.
Okay? Having not arrested somebody at night. Christ was not permitted a defense. Under existing Jewish law at that time, an exhaustive search into the facts presented by the witnesses should have occurred, but did not.
Right.
So he had no defense even. None. The Sanhedrin itself pronounced the death sentence. During Roman captivity, however, the Sanhedrin was not allowed to impose a death sentence. They were not in the act of carrying out or
Capital punishment.
pronouncing capital punishment.
So how did Pilate even let them do any of that
Technically, he
stuff?
didn't. He washed his hands and said,
He
I'm outta
did,
here.
but he still allowed them to go through with it, like from the beginning. Like he really should have stopped it at the beginning.
Well, I mean,
It's
they,
a rabbit court. I mean,
Yeah,
they were, what they did under their law was like, he's like, that's on you. I'm worried about Roman law.
Right.
According to Roman law,
Okay, I
I
got
find no guilt in this
I
matter.
got you.
So that's kind of
Right.
what he was trying to say. Like, you guys
he
are,
can
you know,
pick and choose when and if he recognized their law and their
because he's
proceedings.
not bound to it. And
Right.
Okay.
so, as the Roman historian Tacitus recorded, the Romans reserved to themselves the right of the sword. So they were the only law in the land at that time who could have pronounced a capital punishment according to Roman law. That's it.
Right.
Okay. Now, since the Jews were governed by the Roman law, they did not have the power to execute Jesus on their own. They couldn't. Therefore, we were told that early in the morning, the temple officials took Jesus to the praetorium, realizing that any charge of blasphemy was of little concern to the Romans. The Romans were like, we don't care.
Right.
We're worried about, you know, larger things. We don't care about your law.
They're like, we don't even worry about Zeus.
Right. It's like, you know, it's like, please, seriously? Now, something else to note too is Christ's health up to this point. Now, the most popular means of travel in Jesus' time was walking, boating, and riding on the backs of various animals. That's how he got around. It's likely, therefore, that the daily rigors of his ministry, combined with his young age, ensured that the Lord was in very good physical health before his walk to the Garden of Gethsemane that night. Okay. However, in the short span of time between the institution of the Lord's Supper and the end of the Roman trial, Christ suffered great emotional stress, as evidenced by the probable hematidrosis. Okay, when he was sweating blood. All right. Abandonment by his disciples, and a physical beating after the Jewish trial. It also is important to note that Jesus was forced to walk more than 2.5 miles, okay, to and from the various sites of trials, having slept little, if any, the night before. Okay, so he's been away for 24 hours at this point. Walked all over like crazy. He's been spit on, beat on, cursed at, stressed over. I mean, because he knew what was coming. So, all these factors would have rendered Jesus particularly vulnerable to the physiological effects of the coming scourging, which was brutal in itself. Now, scourging, from John's account, we learn that Jesus had been scourged and brought before the Jews, once again, probably in an effort to forego the execution. At that time, during Roman law, all people who were to be executed were scourged, pretty much almost to the point of death, but not quite. That was to wear them down so that they would die faster. Okay. The only exception to the scourging point prior to an execution was Roman senators, women, and soldiers. The only way the soldiers received it was if they were found in the case of desertion. That's it. All criminals and anyone
Common
of
citizen,
non-Roman, you were going to be scourged, pretty much. It basically weakened the victim through shock and blood loss was the point of what it was for. Without the scourging, strong, condemned men might actually live on the cross for several days until exposure to wild animals, insects, or birds resulted in their death. That's pretty much what happened. Now, to position a man for scourging, okay, well, let me go back. On your first chart here, you'll see a map that I had.
That's what I was just looking at.
Okay. This is the route that they walked Jesus through. All the way out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then out to the traditional Golgotha, Calvary Hill. Okay. So that's the route he pretty much took during that entire period. And encompasses just over the 2.5 miles that he walked that night and day, later that morning and stuff. Now, if you go to the second chart, which will be the chart whipping,
Okay.
you're going to see basically the practice of the scourging to position for the man. Soldiers tied the victim, frequently naked, to an upright post, okay, in a bent position. So you're going to see him basically hanging off the post. This was to, one, expose the body for the whipping, okay. It was also to stretch out the skin and the muscles for premium whipping, okay, so that when they did whip, there was no loose flesh in a way, and this way it made the whipping and the blood loss more expedient. Okay. Usually done with three thongs of leather, as you can see on the cat o' nine, or not cat o' nine, but the whip itself, the flagrum is what they called it. Now it has a wooden handle, leather thongs, metal balls, and small bone pieces, usually from lambs and sheep, things that most are sheep. I'm sorry, they were sheep bones primarily. They took the shards of sheep bone and tied them into the whip. The metal balls were for a contusionary factor,
Right.
okay, for the weight when it hit. It softened it up so that when the bone hit and tore, it was for maximum penetration, blood loss, and ripping. Okay. Basically, by the time they got done, the flesh was nothing more than hanging ribbon when they were done. The offender usually received 13 stripes on the bare breast and 13 across each shoulder, which explains the 40 stripes less 1 administered to Paul in 2 Corinthians. He got whipped the same way. Okay. However, there was no such limit on the number of blows Romans could deliver during a scourging. Okay. Christ's flogging at their hands would have been much worse. Christ would have received repeated blows to his chest, back, buttocks, and legs by 2 soldiers known as lictors, the severity of which depended mainly on the mood of the lictors at the time. If they're having a bad day, guess who else is going to have a bad day? Even worse, times 10. Now, initial anterior blows undoubtedly would have opened the skin and underlying subcutaneous tissue of his chest. Subsequent blows would have tattered the underlying pectoralis major and minor muscles. So it's ripping them open every time it hits. It's nasty. Once these layers were ravaged, repetitive blows could fracture ribs and shred the 3 layers of intercostal muscles, causing superficial and cutaneous vessels of the chest to be lacerated. So they're laying them wide open now at this point. It's kind of like taking a meat tenderizer with balls and scratching it, and eventually, once the meat's been tenderized enough, that's when it starts pulling the flesh out with it. Now, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Pain and blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock at this point. Now, the crown of thorns was a pure sadistic torment that the Roman soldiers placed on an imitation crown on Christ's head and mockingly bowed him in reverence. Okay, this was no ordinary crown. The thorns used to form the special crown were more than a few mere briars. Botanists familiar with the foliage of the Middle East have suggested that the thorns, could have come from the lote tree. This tree had thorns averaging 1 inch in length. It was improbable for anyone to form a wreath-like crown using these thorns without being even injured. Okay. It would have been more probable, therefore, that the crown of thorns was more like a helmet. In fact, it would have been easier to cut off a brush and use it as a helmet of thorns. So basically, you have all these branches that are all in like that, and they're just like cutting out the inside basically real quick, snipping it out, and cutting out the outer edges that were holding it, pulling it off, placing it on his head, not pushing it down with their hands, beating it down with rods and sticks, because they wouldn't even want to touch the thing, because it would have just torn their hands up. And that's how they got it on him, basically. Now, crucifixion, I can cover more of this next week as well, a little bit, because I know we're gonna run out of time, but, basically, before I get into that part of it, I'll just lay out some stuff and then I'll cut off for the night, 'cause I know it's like, run out of time, so. I could actually teach a whole class out of this alone, literally, because it's so much. The typical cross, like you're seeing on your diagram, is again, just in the form of a T. It's not the typical one you see like in a Catholic church or Passion of the Christ or anything like that. That's not the typical cross. This particular cross is what was used in Palestine during Jesus' time by the Romans.
Okay.
Okay. And hang on one second here, find my other note. There were actually multiple types of crosses that the Romans used, okay? And the crosses varied by region, governor, or whoever was in charge. And see, they were given the method of execution, but the perfecting of that execution usually depended on the local guard, captain of the guard, the centurions, and the governor. Because they would take that form of execution and just make it sadistic as possible as they could and perfect their own form of it. And they would come up with various different types of crosses. They had everything from the upside down cross at Peter's.
That's what I was going to say. How would you get crucified upside down if it was just like a T? So
Yeah. They had that. They had the traditional that we see, you know, most of the time on jewelry in Catholic Church and just out in general movies and stuff. They have what they call an X cross. They used to crucify people on that. Yeah. I mean,
I saw that on some other movie, Sword and the Sorcerer.
They also had a tree. They would literally just crucify you to a tree with a patibulum. They would just have a beam and they would just crucify you right to the tree. Or they would use the tree and wrap you around the tree. Oh yeah. They, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but they would even at some point just use a straight pole. That came from Alexander the Great when they first started out. He was the one who actually instituted it. Okay, him and the Persians were the ones who came up with crucifixion. And what they did originally was they would either crucify you to a tree straight, on a straight pole, or on a patibulum, on a tree, or they would just simply impale you on a straight pole and then tie you to it and leave you there. Yeah, it was brutal. The Romans perfected the actual art of crucifixion. I mean, they just took it and said, "Wow, you know, we can do a lot better than this," and they just basically adopted the method and made it to what it was.
They would probably look at us as wimps right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Death by injection, poison, all these various things.
Oh, you're worried that
They
the
were
criminal
like
feels
brutal.
pain?
Yeah.
What about the victims?
Yeah, right.
Now, it was usually customary for the condemned man to carry his own cross from the flogging post to the site of the crucifixion just out city walls. Okay, like I said before, he's usually naked unless this was prohibited by local customs. In this case, this was prohibited for Jesus. Now, since the weight of an entire cross was typically 300 pounds, we know again that's not the type of cross he carried.
Mhm.
Okay, he carried just the beam itself, which they refer to as the patibulum. That weighed approximately 75 to 125 pounds, and then was what word I'm looking for.
Tied to him, he said later crosses.
Yeah.
Tied to him.
It was basically latched to him. He's bound to it, went across the back of his neck, his hands out here, and then he carried it out.
It's crazy.
Processional to the site was usually led by a complete Roman military guard, okay, for each prisoner, headed by a centurion. One of the soldiers would carry the sign on which a condemned man's name and crime were displayed. So that would go out in front for everybody to be able to read. This is why this man is dying, basically. It's another shaming thing. Later, that same titulus or sign would be attached to the top of the cross. The Roman guard would not leave the victim until they were sure that they were dead. That was the only way he could be relieved of that duty. I think I'm going to cut off there. Leaves you hanging a little, but at the same time, it's a good place to actually break into, because here's where we're going to get into how they actually physically put him on the cross. Okay, what this cross actually consisted of, and then the medical aspects of the crucifixion, what he was actually enduring medically up to the point of death. And it is completely mind-blowing. And something I don't think people really talk enough about, honestly. So I think if people actually understood it more, you would probably see people, in my opinion, running from the sanctuary, dry heaving, or just like, oh my gosh, like overload, they can't take it. And you know what? I think they ought to have that put out there. I don't think people think about it enough, honestly. But it's my opinion. So we'll get into that the next week.